Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. I love hearing from all of you, so don't be shy. It was just another regular afternoon for Sarah Lewis, or so it seemed. She stood at the corner of a busy street, her white cane tapping gently on the pavement. Max, her guide dog, stood loyally beside her, watching the world around them. People hurried by, some talking on their phones, others laughing with friends. The traffic lights turned red, and a few cars slowly came to a stop. To anyone looking, Sarah probably seemed like just another blind woman out for a walk, guided by her dog. She was calm, collected, and didn't appear to have a care in the world. Sarah had learned to navigate her city well, even without being able to see it. She could tell where things were just by how they felt or sounded. But there was something about Sarah and Max that made them stand out. It was a detail that most people never noticed, but those who did, they always remembered. You see, Sarah wasn't just any woman. And Max wasn't just any dog. Max wasn't just a guide dog, he was special. But Sarah kept that secret close to her heart. She didn't like to brag about it. She didn't feel the need to tell anyone about Max's incredible past. After all, she didn't want people to treat her differently. She didn't want them to pity her or think that she was some kind of superhero. But deep down, Sarah knew that there was a side to her and Max that no one could even imagine. Most people didn't know that Max wasn't just any dog. He wasn't like the other dogs you might see in the park or walking down the street. Max wasn't your average pet. He wasn't just a dog who helped Sarah cross the street or find her way around the city. Max had been through a lot before he met Sarah. A lot of people, even the ones closest to her, had no idea what Max had done before he became her guide dog. Before becoming Sarah's loyal companion, Max had been trained for something much bigger. He had served as a Navy SEAL K-9. He had worked alongside soldiers in dangerous places, protecting them, helping them find explosives, and doing things that most dogs could never imagine. Max wasn't just a guide dog, he was a trained military hero. He had the skills, the strength, and the courage to do things that would surprise everyone who ever crossed his path. But today, as Sarah stood at the street corner with Max at her side, no one knew any of this. They just saw a woman with a cane and her dog. Nothing special. Nothing out of the ordinary. But what they didn't know was that the moment they stepped into Sarah and Max's world, things were about to change. Sarah didn't look at the people around her. She didn't need to. She could hear them. She could hear the sounds of the city, the hum of the cars, the chatter of the people, and the sound of footsteps all around her. But it wasn't just the sounds she listened to. It was the way they made her feel. Some people, like the group of bikers up ahead, thought she was an easy target. They didn't see a strong, capable woman. They just saw a blind person. They thought they could have some fun, maybe push her around a little. After all, what could she do? She was blind, right? And her dog, well, he was just a dog. A guide dog. What harm could a dog do? But what they didn't know was that they were about to find out just how wrong they were. As Sarah felt the wind on her face, she heard the rumble of motorcycle engines getting closer. She turned her head slightly, hearing the sound of loud, rough voices behind her. She knew exactly who it was. A group of bikers, their engines roaring as they approached. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't move. She didn't even look at them. Max, however, had already tensed up, his ears perked, his body still. Sarah knew what was coming. She had dealt with people like this before, people who thought they could take advantage of her just because they saw her as weak. But Sarah wasn't weak. And Max definitely wasn't weak. Together, they were a team, and they'd faced much worse than a group of bikers who didn't know what they were getting into. As the bikers drew closer, Sarah heard one of them laugh. "Hey, lady, need some help crossing the street?" His voice was loud and mocking. The others laughed too. Sarah could feel the mocking eyes of the group on her, but she didn't let it bother her. She could hear Max growl softly, sensing the tension in the air. The biker spoke again, his voice full of sarcasm, "What's the matter? Scared to cross without your dog?" The laughter grew louder, and Sarah could feel her pulse quicken. This wasn't the first time she'd faced people like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But today was different. Sarah wasn't going to let them get away with it. She wasn't going to just walk away and ignore them. No, she had a secret of her own that they knew nothing about. She took a deep breath and reached down to Max's harness. She didn't say anything, but Max felt the change in her. His body stiffened, his muscles tensing. Sarah stood tall, even though she couldn't see the bikers or the city around her. She knew exactly what was happening. And she was ready. The bikers might have been tough, but they were about to learn that not everything was as it seemed. Sarah had grown used to people treating her like she was weak. She had been blind for most of her life, and sometimes people thought that meant she was helpless. They didn't know her, not really. They just saw the cane and the dog, and they made their own guesses. Sometimes it was small things, like when people spoke louder to her, thinking she couldn't hear them. Or when they would act like she wasn't even there, pushing past her in busy crowds. It was as if they thought she couldn't feel their presence or hear the rude things they said. But Sarah wasn't like that. She wasn't weak, and she wasn't deaf either. She could hear everything around her, every laugh, every whisper, every cruel comment. And she could feel the small bumps and nudges that people made when they didn't think she could see them. Today was one of those days. Sarah was standing on the corner of a busy street, waiting for the light to change so she could cross. Her guide dog, Max, stood beside her, perfectly still, his ears perked up, ready for any command. He was always alert, always paying attention, just like Sarah. They made a good team. But they were about to face something they didn't expect. A group of bikers rolled up on their loud motorcycles, their engines roaring and shaking the air around them. Sarah heard them coming. They weren't just passing by, they were stopping. The sound of the motorcycles stopped right next to her, and she could hear the clanking of their helmets as they got off their bikes. Sarah didn't need to look to know they were there. She could feel the air around her change, the way their voices carried over the sound of the city. These bikers were loud. Too loud. Their laughter and their talking filled the air, almost drowning out all the other noises. They had no concern for the people around them, and that made Sarah uneasy. She didn't like how they acted. They were so full of themselves, like the whole world was there for them to enjoy without any thought of others. One of the bikers, a big man with tattoos all over his arms, swaggered over to Sarah. His leather jacket looked too big for him, and the muscles in his arms bulged as he moved. He didn't look at Sarah as a person. He just saw someone who was easy to ignore. Someone who was different. The biker walked right past her, his elbow knocking into Sarah's shoulder as he moved. It wasn't hard enough to hurt her, but it was enough to show that he didn't care. He didn't think she mattered. "Watch where you're going, lady," the biker said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He didn't even look back to see her reaction, but Sarah felt the coldness in his words. She could hear the others laughing behind him, like they thought it was funny to mess with someone who couldn't see them. Max's ears perked up. He was ready, but he stayed calm. He could feel Sarah's stillness, and he knew she wasn't bothered by the rude man. Not yet. But Sarah could feel the tension building, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Sarah didn't flinch or get angry. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the group. She didn't need to see them to know what was going on. She could hear them loud, rude, and filled with their own sense of power. But instead of feeling upset, Sarah just smiled softly. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, knowing one. She wasn't afraid. She never was. She could feel their eyes on her now. They were sizing her up. The bikers probably thought she was just some quiet, blind woman with a dog. Maybe they thought she wouldn't do anything. After all, what could she do? She couldn't see them, and she had no way of defending herself. But what they didn't know was that Sarah wasn't as helpless as they thought. And neither was Max. Max stood tall, his body still as he waited for Sarah's next move. He could sense something in the air, something wasn't right. He didn't move, not yet. But Sarah knew that the moment would come when she would need him. She knew it. The bikers probably didn't expect much from Sarah. They probably thought she was an easy target. But what they didn't realize was that they had just stepped into a situation they didn't understand. They didn't realize that Sarah was different. And Max was even more different than anyone could guess. Days went by after the incident with the bikers, but it stayed on Sarah's mind. The way they had treated her, like she was just some helpless blind woman with no real strength. It bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She didn't like feeling underestimated. She didn't like feeling small. The bikers, on the other hand, probably didn't think much of it. To them, it was probably just a little joke, something they'd laugh about later with their friends. But what they didn't realize was that they had made a huge mistake. They didn't know who Sarah was, and they certainly didn't know who Max was. Sarah had always been the quiet type. She didn't need to shout about her past or brag about what she could do. She was used to people underestimating her, and she had learned how to be patient. But there was a limit to how much anyone could take. The bikers had crossed that line. Sarah wasn't just anyone. She had a history. A past that no one could have ever guessed just by looking at her. She wasn't just the woman with the white cane and the loyal dog. She was a woman who had faced some of the toughest challenges, and who had learned how to survive in ways most people could never imagine. The bikers had no idea what they had done. They probably thought they could get away with anything, like they always did. But that afternoon, they had poked the wrong bear. It wasn't just Max who made Sarah different. Max wasn't just a guide dog. He was much, much more. Sarah could feel his presence beside her, like he was waiting for the right moment. But what most people didn't know was that Max wasn't just any dog. He was a retired Navy SEAL K-9. That's right. Max had been part of one of the most special and dangerous teams in the world. He had been trained to do things most people could never imagine. He had been a hero in the military, helping soldiers with missions that put their lives on the line. He had tracked explosives, guarded important places, and helped save lives. He wasn't a dog who just sat quietly by his owner's side. Max had a job to do, and when he was called into action, he did it well. Sarah and Max had been through a lot together. Max had been by her side for years, but before that, he had been trained to do things most people would never dream of. And he had done them well. But when Max retired from the Navy SEAL K-9 team, he didn't just stop being a protector. He continued to be Sarah's protector. Sarah had never told anyone about Max's past. She had never felt the need to. She didn't want people to treat her differently because of it. She didn't want them to think that she needed extra help or that she couldn't take care of herself. So she kept it all to herself, and let people think whatever they wanted to think. But the bikers? They had crossed the line. They didn't realize that Sarah wasn't just a blind woman with a cane. They didn't realize that Max wasn't just a dog. They were about to learn that sometimes, the quietest people have the strongest power. Every day, Sarah and Max moved through life together. Sarah went to work, ran errands, and lived her life like everyone else. But the whole time, she carried the knowledge of what Max had done in the past. She carried the strength that came from knowing she wasn't alone. She carried the training that Max had passed on to her, even though she didn't always show it. Sarah had been trained in self-defense. She knew how to protect herself. She knew how to fight back if the time ever came. But even though Sarah had this knowledge, she didn't want to show it off. She didn't want to scare people or make them feel uncomfortable. She just wanted to live her life in peace. That was all she wanted. But sometimes, peace wasn't possible. Max had been trained to protect, and he had never forgotten his training. When the bikers had pushed Sarah, he had sensed it. He had known that something wasn't right, that something was about to happen. He had tensed up, ready to act when the time came. And Sarah, without even saying a word, knew exactly what Max was thinking. She knew that if the bikers didn't back off, Max would do what he had been trained to do. But she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Sarah didn't want to be that person who used force or violence. She didn't want to be known as the woman who couldn't handle things on her own. But when someone crossed the line and threatened her safety, that was when she would take action. She would do what she had to do. She remembered the day when she had first met Max. She had been nervous, unsure about how a dog could help her navigate the world. But from the moment they had met, she knew Max was special. He had been trained for so much more than just guiding a blind person. He had been trained to protect, to follow orders, and to never give up. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a hero. And he had been by her side for so long that she knew they could handle whatever came their way. But the bikers didn't know this. They didn't know about Max's past. They didn't know that Sarah had the skills to defend herself. They didn't know that when Sarah and Max were together, they were a team like no other. They were about to find out, though. The day after the incident with the bikers, Sarah woke up early. She had a feeling that something was going to happen. She had been thinking about what had happened the day before. She had tried to push it out of her mind, but she couldn't. The way they had treated her, the way they had laughed and mocked her, it stayed with her. It made her feel small and helpless, but only for a little while. Today, she wasn't going to let it go. Today, she was going to do something about it. She wasn't going to let the world walk all over her anymore. The next time Sarah crossed paths with the bikers, she could feel the air was different. She had already learned to stay calm and focused, but today, something inside her was ready. The bikers were back, and they were out in full force, just like last time. Their motorcycles roared as they revved their engines, their loud noise echoing down the street. It felt like the whole city could hear them. Sarah knew they were coming. She had been there before, standing at the corner, just like this, waiting to cross the street. Today, however, things would be different. As Sarah stepped forward, making her way toward the corner again, she could already hear them approaching. The sound of their bikes grew louder. She felt the vibrations in the air, a reminder that they were getting closer. And there it was. The sound of the motorcycles slowed down, and Sarah knew they had stopped. She didn't need to turn her head to know that they were right there. One of the bikers, a tall man with dark tattoos snaking up his arms, was the first to speak. His voice was loud, carrying an edge of mockery. "Hey, blind lady," he shouted, clearly hoping to get a rise out of her. "Need some help crossing the street?" He laughed, and soon, the others joined in. The sound of their laughter bounced off the buildings, making Sarah feel even more irritated. It was the same old routine, mocking someone because they thought they could. But this time, Sarah wasn't going to let it slide. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't angry, but she was ready. She could feel the power in her own body, the knowledge that this moment was different. Today, the bikers were about to find out just how wrong they were. As the biker got closer, his voice dripping with sarcasm, Sarah raised her hand. It wasn't much of a gesture, just a simple signal, but to Max, it was everything. The dog's ears perked up, his muscles tensing. Max had been through more in his life than most people could ever imagine. He wasn't just a guide dog. He was a retired Navy SEAL K-9, and he was trained to be alert and ready for anything. Max knew exactly what Sarah needed. The bikers didn't notice at first. They were too busy laughing and thinking they had won. But then, the air seemed to change. The moment Max stood tall beside Sarah, the group of bikers suddenly felt something different. It wasn't something they could explain. It wasn't loud, or obvious, but it was enough to send a chill down their spines. It was the kind of feeling that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. Something was wrong, and they couldn't figure out what it was. The big biker, the one who had spoken to Sarah, stopped laughing. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, he seemed unsure. Sarah's lips curled into a small, calm smile. There was something about her expression that made the bikers feel uneasy, like they had misjudged her completely. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "You think it's funny?" she asked, her tone steady and calm, but carrying a power the bikers didn't expect. "You think this is a joke?" The biker raised an eyebrow and gave her a sarcastic smirk. "What's your deal, lady?" he asked, his voice full of mockery. "What, you think your dog can do anything?" The other bikers laughed again, but this time it was nervous laughter. They didn't understand what was happening, but there was a feeling in the air that made them uneasy. They had poked fun at Sarah before, but they hadn't expected her to react like this. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. Sarah didn't answer him with words. Instead, she took a small step back, just enough to give her room. Her hand gently rested on Max's harness, the signal that it was time. The moment she touched it, Max's muscles flexed, and his whole body seemed to spring to life. In an instant, Max was in action. With lightning-fast speed, the Navy SEAL K9 lunged forward, charging toward the biker. He moved so quickly that the man barely had time to react. Max's growl was low, deep, and menacing. It was the kind of growl that made even the toughest person stop in their tracks. For a split second, the biker's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected the dog to move so fast. He hadn't expected the dog to be so fierce. Max was only inches from the biker's face. The man froze. He could feel the heat of the dog's breath on his skin. He could feel the tension in the air, and for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just a dog. This was a trained warrior, a protector who had seen things that the biker could never imagine. Max was a trained Navy SEAL K9, and in that moment, he was acting on Sarah's command. The group of bikers fell silent. The sounds of their laughter faded away as they watched Max, his body poised to take action. There was no sign of fear in Sarah's eyes. She stood there calmly, watching the biker, waiting to see what he would do next. The bikers had no idea what they had just unleashed. Max didn't move. He stood perfectly still, waiting for Sarah's command. The tension in the air was thick. The bikers didn't know whether to run or stay, and for a moment, they were paralyzed. The big biker who had made fun of Sarah took a step back, his confidence slipping away. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "Now," she said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that none of them had ever heard before. "Are we done here?" The bikers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The coldness in Sarah's voice told them everything they needed to know. She wasn't afraid of them. She wasn't some helpless woman who could be pushed around. She wasn't just the blind lady with the dog. She was someone who knew how to protect herself, and she had a dog who was more than capable of backing her up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bikers took a step back. They slowly started to back away, their eyes on Sarah and Max, realizing that they had misjudged her completely. They didn't say another word. Instead, they hopped back on their bikes and roared off, their engines echoing down the street. Sarah didn't watch them leave. She didn't need to. She had made her point. Max stood by her side, calm as ever, his job done. Sarah smiled down at him, her hand resting gently on his head. "Good boy," she whispered. And just like that, the bikers learned a lesson they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room was the one with the most power. And no one should ever underestimate a woman with a retired Navy SEAL K9 at her side. The bikers slowly stepped back, their eyes wide, their confidence shattered. They were no longer the tough, boisterous group they had been just moments ago. The heavy laughter that had filled the air just a few seconds earlier was replaced by a tense silence. Their faces had gone pale, and their hands hovered near their bikes as if unsure whether to stay or leave. They had never expected to be challenged like this. The tough guy act they had worn so proudly seemed to crumble in an instant. Sarah had shown them that they weren't as invincible as they thought. She wasn't just the quiet blind woman they had thought they could intimidate. She wasn't just anyone. She had Max, her Navy SEAL K9, and Max wasn't a dog to mess with. Sarah turned around, her body moving with a calm confidence that only someone who knew their own power could carry. Max was right beside her, walking in sync with her every step. His eyes were alert, his body still radiating that quiet strength. Together, they made an unlikely pair, one a blind woman, the other a retired Navy SEAL K9. But they were far from weak. They were powerful. They were a force. As Sarah began to walk away from the bikers, she felt the eyes of the people around her. The street was busy, and people had gathered around, drawn in by the commotion. Their eyes were now on Sarah and Max, and she could sense their surprise. There were whispers in the crowd, people talking about what had just happened. Some of them had seen the entire scene unfold, while others were just hearing about it from those who had witnessed it. The bikers, still in shock, stood frozen in place. They didn't know how to react. What had just happened? They had come across someone they thought would be an easy target. But Sarah had proven them wrong. They had underestimated her in every possible way, and now they were left with nothing but embarrassment. The tough exterior they had put on so proudly had melted away the moment Max sprang into action. They hadn't expected a blind woman and her dog to turn the tables on them. Sarah didn't look back at the bikers. She didn't need to. She had made her point. They wouldn't be laughing at her again. They wouldn't be taunting her. And that was enough. She was in control now. Sarah and Max continued walking, their movements smooth and steady. The crowd around them started to disperse, but the whispers remained. Everyone was talking about what they had just witnessed. They couldn't believe what had happened. Some of the onlookers had watched as the bikers had backed away, their bravado slipping away with each step they took in retreat. Others had been too far away to see the full exchange but could sense the change in the air. They knew something had happened, something powerful, and it made them take a second look at Sarah. Some people even looked at her with a new kind of respect. Sarah didn't mind the attention. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about showing off or making a spectacle. It was about standing up for herself and not letting anyone push her around. For so long, she had been the one people overlooked, the one people assumed was weak because of her blindness. But today, she had shown them all just how strong she really was. Max walked beside her, his ears twitching slightly as he stayed alert. He had done his job, and he had done it well. His presence was a reminder of the strength and training he had, a reminder of the bond they shared. Together, they were an unstoppable team. The bikers, on the other hand, hadn't walked away with any dignity. As Sarah and Max continued down the street, they could hear the rumbling of motorcycles starting up again. The bikers were leaving, but not without a look back over their shoulders, as if trying to figure out what had just happened. They had come to harass a blind woman, but they had left defeated, their egos bruised. One of the bikers, the one who had spoken to Sarah earlier, muttered something under his breath. "That lady, she's not what we thought." His voice was low, but Sarah's ears caught the words. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but it was clear that the bikers were shaken. They would never underestimate her again. They would never see her as an easy target. As Sarah walked down the street, she couldn't help but smile to herself. It wasn't a boastful smile. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction. She had stood her ground, and she had made sure the bikers knew that no one, not even the toughest group on the street, could push her around. Max trotted beside her, his tail wagging just slightly. He wasn't just her guide dog, he was her protector. He had served his country as a Navy SEAL K9, and now he was serving Sarah, making sure she was safe and standing by her side through every challenge. It wasn't just the training that made Max so special. It was the bond they shared. He trusted her, and she trusted him completely. Together, they were a force that no one could mess with. The street was quiet now. The bikers had gone, and the crowd had started to break up. But the energy in the air had shifted. People no longer saw Sarah as the helpless blind woman. They saw her for what she truly was, strong, capable, and not someone to be messed with. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And sometimes, those small victories were the ones that mattered most. They didn't just change the way others saw you, they changed the way you saw yourself. Sarah had always known her own strength, but today, she had made sure that others knew it too. As she turned the corner, she heard a voice behind her. "Hey, are you okay?" It was a woman, a passerby who had witnessed the whole thing. Sarah smiled and nodded. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Just a little reminder that some people forget not to mess with others." The woman nodded, a look of admiration on her face. "That was amazing. I don't know if I could have stood up to them like that." Sarah simply smiled and shook her head. "Sometimes you have to," she said. "Sometimes you have to show people that you're not what they think." With that, Sarah and Max continued their walk down the street, their steps steady and confident. The crowd around them had begun to disperse, but the feeling of respect and awe lingered in the air. And as for the bikers, they would never forget the lesson Sarah had taught them that day. They had come looking to pick on someone they thought was an easy target, but they had left with their pride bruised, knowing full well that they had underestimated someone they never should have. The streets were quiet again, but for Sarah, there was a quiet peace in knowing that sometimes, the world needed to be reminded that strength came in all forms, and she, along with her Navy SEAL K9, had just proven that point. Sometimes, we don't really see the strength in people, especially when they don't look like the kind of person we think could stand up for themselves. Sometimes, it's easy to assume someone is weak just because they don't shout, don't make noise, and don't try to show off. But what Sarah and Max showed us that day was something much more important than size or loudness. They showed us that real strength doesn't always need to be flashy. Real strength can be quiet, calm, and steady. Sarah had spent years walking through the world, often unnoticed by people who didn't understand her. They saw a woman who couldn't see. They saw her white cane and assumed that she needed help, or that she couldn't do much on her own. They didn't see her inner strength. They didn't know that her past was full of challenges and that she had learned how to overcome them in ways that most people would never even imagine. And Max, well, Max was no ordinary dog. He was a retired Navy SEAL K9, trained to be one of the most powerful and skilled dogs in the world. But he wasn't just there to guide Sarah. He was there to protect her, to help her feel safe, and to show everyone that just because she couldn't see, didn't mean she was weak or helpless. Together, they were a team. They didn't need to shout their strength for anyone to hear it. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They just lived their lives with purpose, with quiet strength, and with a deep bond that made them unstoppable. And yet, despite all of this, people still underestimated them. People still assumed that because Sarah couldn't see, she was easy to push around. They didn't know the real Sarah, and they definitely didn't know Max. It's like that in the world sometimes. People judge others based on what they see on the outside. If someone is quiet, they might assume that person is weak or shy. If someone doesn't look like they're in charge, they might assume that person doesn't have any power. But the truth is, strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes, strength is quiet. Sometimes, it's steady. Sometimes, it's a dog with a calm look in his eyes, ready to protect his handler at any cost. Sometimes, it's a woman who has faced so much in her life, but still walks through the world with confidence and grace, even when no one is paying attention. Sarah and Max didn't need to make a scene. They didn't need to prove anything to the bikers or to anyone else. But they did anyway. And they didn't do it to show off or to make the bikers feel bad. They did it because sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. Sometimes you have to let people know that just because you seem weak to them, it doesn't mean you are. Sometimes you have to show them that you won't let anyone push you around, no matter who they are or how tough they think they are. What Sarah and Max taught us was important. They reminded us that the loudest and biggest person isn't always the one who holds the most power. Often, it's the quiet person, the one who seems unassuming, who has the real strength. They reminded us that we should never judge someone just by what we see. There's always more beneath the surface, and sometimes that's where the real power lies. It's not in shouting the loudest or trying to intimidate others with size. It's in being calm, being steady, and knowing who you are no matter what anyone else thinks. And the next time you see someone who you think might be an easy target, someone you think might not be able to stand up for themselves, remember Sarah and Max. Stop for a second. Think about the strength that person might have, the strength you might not be able to see right away. You don't know their story. You don't know what they've been through or what they're capable of. Maybe, just maybe, the person you thought was weak is actually much stronger than you realize. It's easy to judge people based on how they look or how they act. We do it all the time, sometimes without even thinking about it. But the truth is, everyone has their own battles, their own strengths, and their own ways of standing up for themselves. Some people do it quietly. Some people do it with a lot of noise. But the important thing is, we all have that strength inside us. And sometimes, it takes something like Sarah and Max's encounter to remind us that we shouldn't be so quick to judge others. You see, the most powerful people in the room aren't always the loudest. The quiet ones, whether they're standing still or walking calmly down the street with their loyal dog at their side, often have the most strength. And when the time comes, they'll show you just how strong they really are. So, the next time you face someone who you think is weaker than you, who you think is easier to push around, think again. You might be standing in front of someone who is just waiting for the right moment to show their strength. They might not need to scream it from the rooftops. They might not need to boast about it. But when the time comes, they will stand their ground, just like Sarah did. Remember this, strength isn't always about being the loudest, the biggest, or the most in your face. Sometimes, it's about being calm, being confident, and standing up for yourself in your own way. And if you ever doubt that strength, just think about Sarah and Max, two quiet souls, one blind and the other a retired Navy SEAL K9, walking through the world with more power than anyone could imagine. They didn't need to say a word. They didn't need to prove anything. But they did anyway. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind the world that strength comes in many forms. And often, it's the quietest ones who have the power to change everything.